In the spring of 1941, a small group of American engineers stood on a windy dock in Rhode Island, watching waves crash against the pilings. They had just received an urgent order from the U.S. Navy: design a lightweight, all-purpose building that could be shipped anywhere in the world, put up by ordinary sailors in hours, and still survive hurricanes, Japanese bombs, jungle rot, and desert heat. The deadline was impossible. The budget was tiny, and the war was already burning across 2 oceans. The man in charge was a quiet civil engineer from Pittsburgh named Peter DeJong. He was 47, wore thick glasses, and spoke so softly that people had to lean in to hear him. But inside his head lived a lifetime of bridges, dams, and grain silos. With him stood Otto Brandenburger, a Swiss-born structural genius who had once designed hangars for Zeppelin airships, and a young lieutenant commander named George Fuller, whose only demand was, "Make it simple enough that my boys can build it drunk in the rain at night." They started with a clean sheet of paper and one radical idea. Forget wood, forget bricks, forget everything heavy. Use only corrugated steel and a shape that nature herself had already perfected, the arch. The first sketches looked almost childish, a half-cylinder lying on the ground, like a giant tin can sliced lengthwise and pressed flat at the bottom. But when De Jong calculated the loads, his pencil stopped moving. Under wind, a rectangle pushes back like a wall and falls over. A dome spreads the force. An arch does something even better. It turns every pound of pressure into pure compression, the one thing steel loves most. Snow, blast waves, 150-mile-an-hour typhoons. An arch simply shrugs and sends the energy down into the ground. Within days, they built a 16-foot-wide prototype in an old seaplane hangar at Quonset Point Naval Air Station. Sailors nicknamed it the Elephant Hut because of its curved back. They hated it on sight. It looked flimsy. It looked temporary. It looked like something a farmer would store hay in. Then came the test nobody expected. A late-season nor'easter roared up the coast. The base commander ordered everything lashed down. The engineers watched from a window as 90-mile-an-hour gusts tore roofs off wooden barracks and flung 55-gallon drums across the runway like toys. When the storm passed, every traditional building on the base had lost shingles, siding, or whole walls. The lone Quonset hut stood untouched, its corrugated skin singing softly in the dying wind. That storm saved the project. Orders flooded in. But the engineers knew the real trials were still ahead. Guadalcanal, Troa, Saipan, places where rain fell sideways for months, where Japanese artillery never stopped, where termites ate tents overnight, and coral dust got into everything. So they went back to the drawing board, not to make the hut stronger, but to make it tougher in ways no way anyone had tried before. They started with the steel itself. Ordinary galvanized sheets rusted in weeks under salt spray. Brandenburger remembered a new aluminum-zinc alloy developed for Navy seaplanes. It cost twice as much, but it laughed at corrosion. They ordered thousands of tons before the accountants even knew what was happening. Next, the floor. Wood rotted. Concrete took weeks to cure on a beach under fire. De Jong designed a simple steel T-section that bolted to the bottom cord. Lay the T's on the ground, bolt the arch ribs to them, and you had an instant raised floor that let air could flow under, keeping mildew away and men dry. But the real stroke of genius was the end walls. Early models used heavy timber frames that took hours to erect. One night, working by lantern light, a young draftsman named Evelyn Clark simply took 2 standard corrugated panels, cut them into a half moon, and bolted them together with angle iron, and stood the whole thing up like a playing card. It weighed 40 pounds. It locked the entire building against racking forces, and 4 men could carry it. By the summer of 1942, the final design was frozen, 20 feet wide by 48 feet long, or 40 feet wide by 100 feet for bigger versions. Every part fitting inside a crate no larger than a pickup truck, total weight under 5 tons, assembly time with hand tools, 6 men, 2 days. No cranes, no welders, no excuses. The first shipment left San Francisco in August. Destination: a mud-soaked island nobody had heard of yet called Guadalcanal. The engineers would not sleep well for 4 more years. They knew what was coming: monsoons that dropped 50 inches of rain in a week, Japanese 14-inch naval shells that turned palm trees into toothpicks, temperatures that cooked film inside cameras, and humidity that made metal sweat rust. They had built the hut as well as they could in Rhode Island. Now the Pacific would show whether an arch of corrugated steel could really keep men alive when the world itself seemed determined to kill them. The first Quonset huts landed on Guadalcanal's Red Beach on August 14, 1942, mixed among crates of ammunition and canned Spam. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalion, tore the boxes open with the same enthusiasm they used on beer cans. Inside were bundles of curved ribs, sheets of silvery corrugated steel, and a single mimeographed sheet titled Erection Procedure, 12 Simple Steps. A grizzled chief petty officer named O'Malley read Step 1 aloud. Select a level site. He looked at the ankle-deep mud, stinking mud, spat, and said, "Well, boys, we'll just have to make it level." They worked in driving rain, barefoot because boots sank and never came back up. By nightfall, they had one hut standing. By the next afternoon, they had 6. On the third day, the Japanese air raid sirens began their daily howl. Zeros came in low over Henderson Field, dropping fragmentation bombs that turned palm trees into splinters. One bomb landed 30 yards from the newest hut. The overpressure wave lifted the corrugated roof half an inch, rattled every bolt, and set the whole building humming like a church organ. When the smoke cleared, the hut was unmarked. The wooden hospital tent next to it had vanished, along with 2 surgeons and 12 wounded Marines. That evening, a Marine colonel walked through the doorless opening, looked around at the dry floor and the lantern light glinting off the clean metal, and said quietly, "I want 50 more by Christmas." The word spread faster than malaria. Quonset huts became the most valuable real estate on the island. Men fought to sleep in them. Officers pulled rank to get their offices moved inside them. The Navy Exchange sold out of padlocks because everyone wanted to lock their hut against borrowers in the night. But the jungle was patient. It sent termites the size of your thumb. They ate tents, crates, rifle stocks, even the leather on binoculars. Yet when the Seabees opened a hut that had stood 6 months untouched, the wooden packing crates inside were riddled with holes, but the steel ribs and skin showed not one chew mark. The termites took a taste, spat it out, and moved on. Then came the monsoon of November 1942. 52 inches of rain in 21 days. Rivers changed course overnight. Foxholes became wells. Men drowned in their sleep when trenches collapsed. The Quonset huts sat on their little steel T-rails 6 inches above the flood, dry inside, while Marines lined up in the rain begging to be let in just for an hour, sir, please. One enterprising Seabee charged $1 a night per cot and retired after the war a wealthy man. Across the Pacific, on every island the Americans clawed back from the Japanese, the same scene repeated itself. Land, fight, survive, then build Quonsets. On Tarawa, the huts went up while Japanese snipers still hid in the palm stumps. On Saipan, they assembled them under naval bombardment that shook the coral until your teeth ached. On Tinian, a hut took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb that failed to explode. The bomb punched through the roof, rolled across the floor, and came to rest against a sea bag. The men inside carried on playing poker by lantern light, simply moving the pot a little to the left. The Navy started calling them survival machines. The Marines had a shorter name, home. Yet every miracle has a price. In the Marianas, the temperature inside an unshaded hut reached 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 57 degrees Celsius. Men passed out from heat stroke. Paint blistered off Jeeps parked beside them. The engineers back in Quonset Point received frantic cables. "DO's something about the heat or we cook alive." So Peter de Jong and Otto Brandenburger went to work again, this time not on strength, but on comfort. They remembered the Bedouin tents of North Africa, the wind catchers of Persia, the simple truth that hot air rises. They designed a continuous ridge vent hidden under a cap strip, plus 4 Louvre gable vents that could be opened or closed with a boat hook from the ground. Cool air was sucked in at the bottom, hot air escaped to the top. In tests back in Rhode Island, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. They also developed a porous canvas liner that snapped to the inside of the ribs like a curtain. Wet it down at noon, and the breeze through the vents turned the hut into a primitive evaporative cooler. Men wrote home that for the first time in 2 years, they slept without sweating through their sheets. The final gift to the men in the tropics was paint. Not just any paint, but a top-secret infrared reflective coating developed for bomber noses. Applied to the roof, it knocked another 10 degrees off the interior temperature. The Navy classified the formula until 1944, but every Quonset shipped after D-Day wore the new pale green skin that looked almost white in the sun. By the end of 1943, more than 150,000 Quonset huts had been manufactured. They housed everything. Hospitals that saved thousands of lives, radar stations that guided night fighters, chapels where men got married by proxy, even ice cream plants that turn out 10 gallons every hour for boys who hadn't tasted cold since San Diego. But the war was not finished with them yet. The toughest test was still waiting in the frozen North Atlantic and, later, on the wind-blasted islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where typhoons with 180-mile and hour winds would try to peel the steel off the ribs like orange rind. The engineers back home read the after-action reports, rubbed tired eyes, and reached for their slide rules once more. On June 18, 1944, a typhoon named Cobra hit the fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll with winds measured at 185 miles per hour. American warships dragged anchors and collided like toys. A destroyer lost its entire bridge structure. Yet when the storm cleared, every Quonset hut on Little Mogmog Island still stood exactly where the Seabees had planted them 9 months earlier. One lieutenant wrote home, "The only thing left upright on this base is the beer garden, and it's made of Quonset steel." That same summer, the island of Tinian prepared for the most terrible mission of the war. In a fenced compound ringed by machine guns, Seabees worked in absolute secrecy. They erected a row of specially modified Quonsets, extra ventilation, reinforced doors, heavy blast walls at one end. Inside one of them, under a bare bulb, Colonel Paul Tibbets and his crew practiced loading a 10-foot-long object painted matte black and marked only with a stenciled L11. The hut never leaked a word. On August 6, 1945, the object left Tinian inside the Enola Gay. The Quonset hut was torn down the same day and its parts scattered so no historian would ever find it. But long before Hiroshima, the huts had already saved more American lives than any medicine or weapon. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, the 5th Marine Division landed with 30 portable Quonset hospitals. Japanese mortar fire was so intense that the first wounded arrived before the huts were finished. Corpsmen operated on the bare steel floor, while Seabees bolted the last ribs overhead. Shells burst 50 yards away. The arches rang like cathedral bells, but never buckled. In 21 days, those 30 huts treated 14,357 wounded Marines. Only 2 men died because the roof failed them, and both times the roof was wooden, not steel. The Navy learned something on Iwo that made the engineers back home weep with pride. When a Japanese 320mm spigot mortar shell, the ones the Marines called flying manhole covers, landed directly on a Quonset hospital, the roof peeled open like a tin of sardines. Yet the curved ribs held the walls upright long enough for corpsmen to drag every patient out through the sides before the whole building collapsed. A rectangular building would have pancaked in an instant and buried them all. After Iwo came Okinawa. 90 days of rain, mud, and kamikaze. Typhoon Louise followed in October 1945 after the surrender, catching the victorious fleet by surprise. Winds hit 150 knots. The Navy lost 36 ships, sunk or wrecked, 100 more grounded. On Okinawa itself, every wooden building on the island was destroyed or damaged. Only the Quonset survived. One photograph, still famous among engineers, shows a single 40 by 100-foot Quonset standing alone on a ridge, surrounded by a moonscape of splinters and twisted corrugated iron that had once been hundreds of Japanese barracks. The caption written on the back by an unknown Seabee reads simply, American Know-How 1, Nature 0. By VJ Day, in September 1945, the United States had manufactured 170,432 Quonset huts. They had gone everywhere men fought. The ice of Attu in the Aleutians, where engineers bolted them to permafrost and heated them with oil drums cut in half. The burning sands of North Africa, where the British painted them desert pink and used them as Rommel's old headquarters after Alamein. Even the Burmese jungle, where Lord Mountbatten's engineers lashed them to teak platforms above the leeches. And still the war found new ways to test them. In December 1944, a Quonset warehouse on Saipan took a direct hit from a Japanese 500 kilograms bomb. The explosion lifted the entire building 6 feet into the air and set it back down almost exactly on its foundation bolts. The end walls were gone, the contents destroyed, but the arch itself was so perfectly balanced that it floated, landed, and stood waiting for new end walls as if nothing had happened. The base commander cabled Quonset Point. The damned hut is harder to kill than a cockroach. The men who designed them never saw most of these miracles. Peter de Jong spent the war in a small office, reading casualty reports and cables that ended with the same 3 words. Quonsets performed magnificently. He kept everyone in a locked drawer. When the drawer grew too full, he started second. He never showed them to anyone, not even his wife. Otto Brandenburger, the Swiss, returned to Europe in 1946 and discovered entire villages in Normandy living in American Quonset huts abandoned by the army. Old French farmers had painted flowers on the corrugated walls and planted roses against the steel ribs. Children used the curved roofs as slides. Brandenburger sat down on a crate outside one hut and cried for the first time since 1939. But the greatest surprise was still to come. In 1946, the War Department declared 30,000 Quonsets surplus and sold them to civilians for as little as $400 each. Farmers bought them for barns. Churches bought them for fellowship halls. Families in California bought them because there was no other housing after 4 years of frozen construction. Universities bought them for married student housing. The little half-cylinder born in wartime desperation suddenly became the most common new building in America. And in the summer of 1947, something happened that no engineer had ever predicted. A man in Illinois decided to stay inside his Quonset barn during a tornado. The storm lifted his house off its foundation and flung it 2 counties away. When the sky cleared, the man crawled out of the barn without a scratch. The Quonset had not moved an inch. Within months, tornado-prone towns across the Midwest were ordering Quonsets by the trainload. The Navy, amused, reprinted the old wartime erection manuals with a new cover. Your family's best chance against nature's worst. The steel arch had come full circle. Born to protect soldiers from bombs and typhoons, it now protected grandmothers from funnel clouds in Kansas. But the story was not quite finished. One last theater waited, colder and crueler than any jungle or desert, where men would ask the humble Quonset hut to do what no building had ever done before: keep life alive at the top of the world. In the winter of 1946 to 47, while most Americans were still trying to buy a new Chevrolet, a quiet Navy captain named Gerald Ketchum walked into the old Quonset Point offices carrying a folder stamped top secret in red. He laid it on Peter de Jong's desk without ceremony. Admiral Byrd wants 30 huts for Antarctica. Not next year, this year. And they have to survive minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 200-mile-an-hour blizzards, and being buried under 20 feet of snow. Can you do it? De Jong opened the folder. Inside was a single photograph. A windsock frozen stiff as a board pointing straight out in a white void. He closed the folder and said the same thing he had said in 1941. We'll need better steel. What followed was the most brutal redesign in the hut's history. First, the metal. Ordinary galvanized steel becomes brittle below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and shatters like glass. The engineers switched to a new high-nickel alloy developed for Arctic destroyers. It cost a fortune, but it stayed flexible even when liquid oxygen was poured on it. Next, the joints. At those temperatures, bolts contract faster than nuts and seize solid. They replaced every bolt with aircraft-style high-lock pins that could be installed with a hand ratchet and never came loose again. Then the real nightmare: snow load. A single Antarctic storm can drop the equivalent of 300 pounds per square foot. A normal Quonset roof would fold like paper. Otto Brandenburger, now 62 and half retired, came back for one last job. He designed a double-rib system, an inner arch inside the outer arch, connected by diagonal bracing every 4 feet. The two skins turned the hut into a bridge, truss lying on its side. Calculated failure point: 620 pounds per square foot, more than any storm on Earth had ever delivered. They also invented the igloo skirt, a 2-foot-high vertical steel wall bolted to the bottom of the main arch, snow piled against the skirt instead of sliding under the floor and lifting the building off its anchors the way it had crushed earlier polar stations. Finally, insulation. The Navy had a new material nobody outside Los Alamos had seen yet: aluminium foil laminated in multiple layers with air gaps. It weighed almost nothing and stopped radiant heat the way a brick wall stops a bullet. They lined the entire interior with it, then added a second skin of plywood on the inside so the men wouldn't freeze to their own walls when they leaned against them. The first 11 huts left Norfolk, Virginia, in October 1947 aboard the icebreaker USS Burton Island. The crew nicknamed them Bird's Tin Igloos. When Operation High Jump reached the Ross Ice Shelf in January 1948, the temperature was minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The Seabees, wearing bunny boots and parkas stiff with frost, put the first hut up in 11 hours after the ship tied up to the ice. They worked by floodlights in a wind that cut through reindeer gloves. When the last pin clicked home, they stepped back, expecting, almost hoping, the thing would blow away just to prove they were still alive. Instead, it sat there gleaming, motionless, while drift snow hissed across the roof like blown sand. Within a month, Little America 4 rose out of the ice. 30 silver arches in a neat row, connected by insulated tunnels, heated by diesel Warmore stoves that glowed cherry red. Inside, men walked around in shirt sleeves eating peach ice cream, while outside the katabatic winds hit 180 miles an hour and the thermometer bottomed out at minus 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The huts did not merely survive. They laughed. One night, a tractor broke through the ice into a hidden crevasse. The driver was rescued, but the tractor vanished. 6 weeks later, when the crevasse closed again under snow pressure, the tractor was pushed back up, crushed flat, directly beneath a Quonset galley. The hut had sagged half an inch. Not one rib cracked. The cook went on serving coffee without spilling a cup. Admiral Byrd sent a short radio message that was read aloud in the Quonset Point cafeteria. Tell De Jong and Brandenburger their huts are the only warm thing in this goddamned place, including my heart. When the expedition returned in 1948, the Navy left the huts behind, anchored to the ice with steel cables and prayers. Satellite photographs still show them today, half buried but upright, 77 years later, the longest-lasting man-made structures on the continent. Back in America, civilians began to notice something strange. Wherever disaster struck, Quonset huts appeared like guardian angels. After the 1953 Worcester tornado demolished half the city, the Red Cross ordered 400 huts overnight. They went up in days and housed families for 3 years. After Hurricane Carol in 1954 flattened coastal New England, the governor of Rhode Island lived in a Quonset hut because the state house roof was gone. In Alaska, after the 1964 earthquake, entire towns moved into Quonsets while the ground still shook. Farmers discovered that if you buried half a Quonset in a hillside and poured concrete over the top, you had a root cellar that stayed 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round with no electricity. Universities discovered they made perfect field stations, cheap laboratories, and, when two were bolted together along the straight sides, instant lecture halls that seated 200. By 1960, more Quonset huts stood in civilian hands than had ever served in the military. The Navy stopped counting at 200,000, and still the stories kept coming. A farmer in Iowa wrote that his hut had been picked up by a tornado, carried 300 yards and set down gently in a cornfield. The door still opened. A church in Mississippi wrote that theirs had floated 3 miles during the 1965 flood and was found high and dry on a levee, organ untouched. An old Seabee in California, dying of cancer in 1972, asked to be buried in the Quonset hut he had built on Guadalcanal 30 years earlier. His family couldn't find it. Someone else had turned it into a taco stand on the old Henderson Field runway. The little half-cylinder refused to die. But one last, quiet chapter remained, the one that would make grown men weep in hardware stores 40 years later, when an entire generation discovered that the ugliest building in America had also been the most loved. In the spring of 1973, Peter DeJong, now 79, frail, and almost blind, received a letter forwarded from an address he had left 25 years earlier. The envelope was cheap drugstore stationery. The handwriting shaky, the ink faded to brown. It began, "Dear Sir, you never met me, but I slept under your roof for 1,143 nights, and I never once woke up wet or afraid. My name is Thomas Patrick O'Rourke, SGT, USMC, 1st Division. I am dying in a VA hospital in Togus, Maine, and I have one last request." The letter went on to explain that O'Rourke had been an 18-year-old replacement on WWII in September 1944. His first night ashore, the Japanese shelled the beach for 8 straight hours. Every tent was shredded. He crawled, bleeding from shrapnel in both legs, toward a single light he saw glowing through the smoke. It was a newly erected Quonset hospital. A corpsman dragged him inside, laid him on a cot, and said, "Welcome home, Marine." For the rest of the war, WWII, Okinawa, occupation duty in Japan, O'Rourke never slept anywhere else if he could help it. After discharge, he became a carpenter, got married, raised 4 children, and every house he ever built had a Quonset garage in the backyard because straight walls always felt wrong after that. Now, the cancer had him. He had no money for a stone, but the hospital chaplain had agreed to bury him in the little Catholic cemetery behind the wards. All he wanted was 6 corrugated panels from a real wartime Quonset hut to be made into a simple arched cover over his grave, so the rain sounds the same as it did when I was young and the world was trying to kill us. DeJong read the letter 3 times through a magnifying glass, then asked his daughter to drive him to the old strand steel plant in Ecorse, Michigan, which had made every panel during the war. The plant was half abandoned, weeds growing through cracked concrete. In a far corner, under a collapsed roof, they found a stack of olive drab panels left to rust since 1946. The foreman, a man who had been a riveter in 1943, helped them load 6 sheets into a pickup truck without a word. He already knew the story. Every old-timer in Detroit did. 2 weeks later, on a cold May morning, 30 men in VFW caps stood in the Togus cemetery while a priest blessed a small arched shelter of faded corrugated steel. They lowered Thomas O'Rourke beneath it with full military honors. When a bugler played taps, rain began to fall, soft, steady Maine rain that drummed on the curved roof exactly the way it had on WWII 30 years before. The old Marines smiled through tears. They knew that sound better than any lullaby. That grave marker started something. Within a year, similar small Quonset arches began appearing on veterans' graves from California to Normandy. Some were made from new metal, some from scraps of the original huts. No one organized it. It simply happened, the way old soldiers share a cigarette without asking. In 1981, the last surviving designer, Otto Brandenburger, died in Zurich at the age of 92. His ashes were scattered over Lake Geneva, but his family received an anonymous package from America. 1 corrugated panel, carefully rolled, with a note in childish handwriting. From the boys of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Okinawa, 1945. Thank you for the extra years. Peter DeJong lived to see the 50th anniversary of the first Quonset in 1991. By then he could no longer speak, but when a television crew brought him to the old hangar at Quonset Point, now a museum, and sat him beneath the very first prototype, restored and gleaming, the old man reached out and laid his palm flat against the cold steel rib. His daughter said he smiled wider than he had in 10 years. He died 3 months later quietly, in his sleep. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find them. A Quonset church in the Outer Hebrides where islanders worshipped all through the war. A Quonset bar in Saigon that somehow survived the fall of the city in 1975. A Quonset kindergarten in Greenland painted bright yellow. A Quonset winery in Napa Valley, where the curve of the roof is said to give the wine better angels share. And every year, on the 14th of August, the day the first crate landed on Guadalcanal, a handful of very old men, or their sons and grandsons, meet somewhere quiet, open a bottle, and tap it gently against corrugated steel. They don't say much. They don't need to. The rain on the roof says everything for them. The ugly little half-cylinder, born in panic and built by the million, turned out to be one of the most humane things America ever sent into the world. It kept men alive through the worst century humans ever devised, then kept their memories warm long after the guns went silent. And whenever another storm comes, hurricane, tornado, war, or simply time, someone somewhere will bolt a few curved sheets of steel together, step inside, close the door, and listen to the rain singing the same song it sang in 1942. Home, safe, still standing.